Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the Ozark Mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment letting me know where you are and what time it is where you are listening to this narration. We want to know what places and times of day or night these written accounts get to. It was 1866, and the Civil War had only just ended in America. People have always gone to the Ozark Mountains to hide out. Some were running from the law, some from society, and some, maybe, from their own memories. There was a cabin in Washington County, Arkansas, near the western bend of the White River. People in the area would eventually call it the Boyle Place. Jeremiah Hawkins, a land surveyor, was mapping the area for a possible railroad expansion in April 1869 when he found the cabin by accident. It was hidden deep in a rocky hollow. It looked like the building had been empty for a while, with tall weeds growing around it and no smoke coming from the chimney, even though it was spring and cold. Hawkins' field journal says that he approached the cabin with professional curiosity instead of fear, which he later regretted writing down. The door was slightly open, and the wind from the mountains made it creak. Hawkins yelled, but no one answered. He came in to mark the structure on his maps as part of his normal routine. What he found in the Boyle cabin would haunt him for the rest of his life and become the talk of the town in Washington County for decades to come. It looked like the people who lived in the cabin had just disappeared in the middle of their daily lives, as if they had never left. There were 3 plates on a wooden table, each with the dried-up remains of what looked like a meal. A pot hung over the fireplace's cold ashes. The rocking chair by the window kept swaying a little bit in the draft. But what Hawkins found in the back room made him drop his survey tools and ride straight to Fayetteville to tell the county sheriff. Sheriff Thomas Muldrow's official report from the 17th of April, 1869, says that he and Hawkins and 2 deputies went into the cabin together. The document, which was kept in the Washington County Historical Archives until it was controversially taken down in 1951, describes the discovery in clinical terms that still convey a deep sense of disturbance. They found what looked like a workshop in the back room. There were dozens of glass jars on the shelves, each holding a different preserved specimen that Muldrow called items of a deeply concerning nature. A big wooden table with a dark stain on its surface took up most of the room. There were a lot of handwritten journals stacked neatly on a small desk in the corner. The sheriff told his deputies right away to gather the journals and lock up the cabin. In just a few days, a troubling story began to come out of the pages of those leather-bound books. It was the story of Tobias Boyle and what brought him to the remote hollow after the war. County records show that Tobias Boyle bought the land in October 1866. He paid with gold coins and didn't give much information about himself or what he planned to do with the land. He came with what people in the nearest settlement, about 5 miles away, called a woman with a haunted look and a man whose relationship to Boyle was never made clear. The journals, which started in November 1866, and ended in February 1869, kept a very detailed and disturbing record of Boyle's activities. At first, they were just boring notes about building the cabin, hunting, and starting a small garden. But by January 1867, the entries had changed to something darker. Boyle, who said he used to be a surgeon in the Confederate Army, started writing down what he called the continuation of my research, unburdened by the short-sighted restrictions of military oversight. Sheriff Muldrow's official report never clearly said what this research was about. A court order sealed pages from the journals because they were too disturbing to be made public. However, people who worked with the documents say that Boyle was doing some kind of experimental study, maybe based on his experiences during the war. The journals only referred to the woman as E. They said that as the months went on, she became more and more withdrawn and scared. What wasn't found was the most troubling part of the case. It was clear that 3 people lived in the cabin, but only 2 sets of personal items were found. The identity and fate of the 3rd person who lived there became the main mystery that would never be fully solved. Boyle's journal entry from the 22nd of February 1869, the last one with a date, read, "The patience of observation must yield to the necessity of direct participation. E refuses to acknowledge the potential. Tomorrow, all will be clarified." After that, the journals went silent. Even after a thorough search of the area, no bodies were ever found on the property. The 3 people who lived in the Boyle cabin had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their belongings and the disturbing signs of what they had been doing while they were alone. After the discovery, local officials tried harder to find out more about the people who had lived there before. Records show that a Tobias Boyle was a field surgeon with the 3rd Arkansas Infantry, but after the surrender at Appomattox, the trail went cold. There was no record of what he did between the end of the war and his arrival in the Ozarks. It was impossible to tell who the woman, who was thought to be E, or the 3rd person in the room were. At first, the sheriff's investigation focused on the possibility of foul play, assuming that Boyle might have hurt his friends before running away. But the fact that there was no evidence of violence in the cabin went against this idea. The plate set for dinner made it seem like someone had to leave or stop suddenly, not that they had planned to leave. James Calloway, one of the deputies, wrote in his personal diary that as they got closer to the cabin, they felt an unaccountable sensation of heaviness, as though the air itself resisted our presence. Several members of the search party felt the same way, and one man even refused to go inside, saying that the threshold seemed to push back against my intentions. Sheriff Muldrow called these personal experiences superstitious nonsense, but almost everyone who went to the site in the years that followed had similar stories. The state of the forest around it was even more confusing. Even though the cabin was in a thick forest, searchers said they didn't see any animal tracks or signs within 100 yards of the building. If it weren't for Dr. William Hawthorne, a doctor from Street Lewis who was interested in medical practices during the Civil War, the case might have become a local legend. Hawthorne found references to the Boyle case in letters he wrote to Arkansas officials in 1887 while he was writing a book about medicine on the battlefield. He was interested and went to Fayetteville to look at what was left of the evidence. At this point, locals had torn down the cabin because they thought it brought bad luck to the area. A county judge told them to destroy the jars and most of the physical evidence. The journals, or what was left of them after some parts were cut out, were still kept in the county records, though. Hawthorne was allowed to see only a small part of the work, and his notes are one of the few secondary sources on what it contained. Hawthorne's private letters, which were later published in the Journal of Historical Medicine in 1912, said that Boyle's writing made him sound like a man who was obsessed with figuring out what makes people strong. Hawthorne quotes from the journals, "I have become convinced that the conventional understanding of human vitality is fundamentally flawed. After seeing men survive serious wounds that should have killed them, and others die from what seemed like minor injuries." Hawthorne observed that Boyle's initial entries exhibited a clinical detachment. However, as time elapsed, a troubling fervor emerged in his documentation. Hawthorne's notes say that Boyle had ideas about consciousness existing in separate parts, and that these parts could be separated and kept safe in certain situations. This was especially concerning for Hawthorne, because Boyle called it the partitioning of awareness during traumatic states. Boyle recounted observing soldiers on the battlefield who, despite sustaining catastrophic injuries, experienced intervals of lucidity that eluded medical explanation. These events seemed to have led him to believe that consciousness was not a single thing, but something that could be broken down into parts, like anatomical specimens. Hawthorne's research also uncovered a troubling trend in Boyle's military career. Army medical records showed that some of Boyle's patients had strange conditions after surgery. Nurses who were there called them responsive yet absent. One report talked about a soldier with a bad head wound who, after being treated by Boyle, was still able to move around and follow simple commands, but seemed to have lost all sense of self. The report was filed as a curiosity instead of a worry because battlefield hospitals were so chaotic. It was still unclear who Boyle's friends were, but Hawthorne's research found a possible lead. In 1864, hospital records from Richmond mentioned a Dr. Boyle working with a nurse named Ellen M. Several patients said they were very close, and one recovering officer wrote home about Dr. Boyle and his nurse companion performing examinations of an unorthodox nature after the senior surgeons had gone home for the night. Hawthorne was especially interested in a note in Boyle's military file that said he had been briefly moved to an unnamed Special Medical Research Unit during the last few months of the war. It was said that the unit's job was to come up with new surgical methods, but records of this were lost when Richmond burned down. Ellen M.'s name was missing from hospital records at the same time as this reassignment, which suggests that she may have gone with him to this new job. The third person who lived in the cabin was still a mystery. People in the area were talking about a lot of different things, like an escaped prisoner, a patient that Boyle wanted to keep treating, or maybe even a family member of either Boyle or the woman. No matter what the truth is, the identity of this person would become very important to the disturbing discoveries that came to light decades later. When he got back to St. Louis, Hawthorne put together his research into a book called Unorthodox Medical Practices in the Late War, which had a chapter on the Boyle case. However, before the book came out, the Washington County Clerk sent him a letter saying that sharing information about the Boyle case could lead to legal action for disturbing public sensibilities with unfounded speculations. Hawthorne took out the Boyle chapter, and his notes on Boyle were kept private until after he died in 1916. The Boyle property changed hands several times over the years, but it was never developed. Farmers in the area said that crops planted near the old cabin site died for no apparent reason, and animals wouldn't eat there. People started to think that the hollow was unwholesome, and by the turn of the century, it had been mostly left to the forest that was growing around it. The Boyle case might have stayed a local oddity if it hadn't been for the flooding in the White River Valley in June 1923, which changed the geology of the whole area. A limestone sinkhole opened up on what used to be the Boyle property, and it showed that there was a cave system underneath the old cabin site that had never been seen before. When Josiah Miller's dog came back from exploring the opening with what looked like a human bone, he told the police about it. He was a local farmer at the time. County workers dug up the cave's entrance and found something very sad. The small passages led to a bigger room that looked like people had been there before. There were stone shelves carved into the walls, and a central stone table had rusty metal tools all over it. The markings on the walls were the most disturbing. They were intricate diagrams and notes carved into the limestone that looked like anatomical drawings, but they had strange differences that didn't make sense. There were no complete human remains in the cave, but there were some bone fragments. The most confusing thing for investigators was the proof that someone had intentionally closed the cave from the inside. There were big stones stacked up like a barricade some distance from the entrance. It looks like this barricade was up long before the sinkhole formed, which means that someone must have closed themselves inside the cave system on purpose at some point. Officials quickly closed off the new entrance, saying that the flooding made it unsafe. The Fayetteville Democrat published a short article on the 14th of June, 1923, that only said that unusual formations had been discovered on the old Boyle property and that the area was off limits to the public. But before the cave was sealed again, County Coroner Dr. Franklin Pierce took a quick look at the bone pieces that had been found there. His report, which was kept in county records but never made public, pointed out a number of strange things. Pierce talked about precise cuts that could only have been made with surgical tools, as well as signs of drilling and the insertion of foreign material into the bone structure. What bothered him the most was that some of the pieces looked like they had been fused with a metal alloy of unknown composition, and it looked like this happened while the tissue was still alive. Pierce's report ended with a suggestion that the bone pieces be sent to a university lab for more in-depth study. The pieces came from people, but they had strange changes. But county records show that Judge William Harrison ordered the specimens to be destroyed instead. He said he was worried about potential desecration of human remains. Harrison was the nephew of a Confederate veteran who had served in the same regiment as Tobias Boyle. That might have been the end of it, but in 1945, Dr. Margaret Holcomb, a historian looking into medical practices during the Civil War, found the sealed records of the original investigation while working in the Washington County Archives. Her next paper, which came out in the little-known Journal of Historical Appalachian Studies, made a number of troubling connections in the Boyle story. Holcomb said that Boyle's military records showed that he had been punished twice for doing things that weren't allowed on injured soldiers. She also found a report from a Confederate medical inspector that said Boyle had come up with what he called unorthodox theories about human awareness during extreme physical states. The inspector suggested that Boyle be fired, but it seems that the war's last few months were so desperate for surgeons that no action was taken. Holcomb also found what might have been the most important document in the case, a letter from Ellen Morrison, a nurse who worked with Boyle in Richmond, to her sister in Baltimore. The letter, which was written in March 1865, showed that people were getting more and more worried about Boyle's behavior. She wrote, "His interests have changed from healing to something I can't understand. He talks about how to cross the line between states of being and how to expand consciousness beyond what nature intended. I'm worried that the horrors we've seen have affected his mind, but I can't leave him after everything we've been through together." The letter went on to talk about a patient named Subject 11, who Boyle had apparently been very interested in after suffering a serious head injury. T spends hours watching him and writing down every little thing he does. Last night, I found him talking to the patient about how consciousness is stored in compartments and how a mind that is ready can be split up like an orange, with each part having its own awareness. When I walked in, he stopped talking, but his eyes showed excitement that I haven't seen since before Antebellum. Holcomb thought that Ellen Morrison was probably the E that Boyle wrote about in his journals. He also thought that the two of them had run away to the West after the war, maybe to continue Boyle's research without being watched. More importantly, she suggested that Subject 11 could have been the third person in the cabin, a patient that Boyle had somehow gotten out of military custody to use as a research subject. Holcomb's search took her to the records of the Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, where Boyle had been stationed in early 1865. She found an entry for a soldier in the patient logs. The soldier was only known as Patient 11 and had a serious head injury that made him physically responsive but mentally vacant. The entry said that on the 12th of February 1865, the patient was moved to a special research ward, but there was no more information about his condition or what happened to him after that. This happened at the same time that Boyle was moved to the special medical unit, which supports Holcomb's theory that Boyle may have taken this patient for his own use. The most terrifying part of Holcomb's research was when she found a partial transcript of an interview with Jeremiah Hawkins that took place in 1889, just before he died. For decades, the old surveyor who first found the cabin had refused to talk about the case in public. But during this private interview with a local historian, Hawkins finally talked more about what he saw in the back room of the cabin. Hawkins said, "The jars held things that shouldn't have been kept, parts that looked human but were twisted in ways I can't explain. There was also a brass and wood device on the table with straps, as if to hold someone down. But the drawings disturbed me the most. They were detailed pictures of a human body, with dotted lines separating the body, not in the usual anatomical way, but in a way that made it seem like Boyle thought consciousness itself could be divided and preserved." Hawkins then talked about pages from Boyle's journal that had never been made public. He wrote about consciousness as something that could be split up, like cutting up a fruit, with each piece keeping some of the whole. There were parts where he talked about experiments, I can't call them anything else, in which he said he had separated awareness from the brain and put it in certain parts of the body. The most disturbing entry talked about moving these separate pieces between subjects, and his ultimate goal of getting what he called distributed consciousness across many vessels. When asked why he hadn't told the police about these things at the time, Hawkins said, "I did. Sheriff Muldrow heard my full account, but the next day he told me that certain parts of my testimony would not be included in the official report to avoid unnecessary panic. He told me very firmly to forget what I had seen and read. When I protested, the sheriff reminded me that telling stories like that could be seen as a public disturbance under county law." Holcomb's paper caused a brief stir in academic circles, but didn't get much attention from the general public. The Washington County Historical Society officially disagreed with her conclusions. In 1951, many of the original documents related to the Boyle case were taken out of public view, supposedly to keep them safe. The next year, Holcomb took a job at a university on the East Coast and didn't write anything else about it. It's interesting that Holcomb left behind a sealed envelope in her personal papers that she gave to her university's archives after she died in 1978. The envelope said not to open it until 2025. This requirement has been followed, and as of this recording, the contents are still unknown. The case faded from memory until 1967, when geological surveys were needed near the old Boyle property to make way for a new highway through the area. Engineers found out that the cave system was bigger than they had thought, and that it had been changed for human use, at least in part before Boyle got there. Artifacts found in the deeper chambers were dated using carbon dating, which showed that people had been there since the early 1800s. This raised the possibility that Boyle chose the location because of its existing underground features rather than by chance. Dr. Howard Ramsey, a geologist, led the survey team that found a complicated network of chambers that went almost a quarter-mile into the hillside. What they found showed that Boyle had made big changes to the natural cave system for his own use. Chisel marks on the walls showed that some chambers had been purposely made bigger, while others had been carefully sealed. The most interesting thing was the proof of a complex ventilation system, narrow shafts that had been drilled through the limestone to the surface, letting air flow through the whole complex. The team found what looked like a workshop area in the deepest chamber, which could only be reached through a narrow passage that required crawling. This area was much bigger than what had been found in the 1923 investigation. People carved stone tables out of living rock and cut channels into their surfaces that led to collection basins. Ramsey's official report said that the markings looked like anatomical illustrations mixed with electrical circuit diagrams, which led to the idea that they were trying to mix biological and mechanical ideas in a way that didn't fit with traditional scientific categories. Later, linguists and cryptographers looked at photographs of the markings and decided that they made sense as a coherent notational system rather than random scrawlings, but they couldn't figure out what they meant. The cave floor was covered in rusted pieces of metal tools, and the walls were covered in intricate markings, diagrams, notes, and what looked like a complicated symbolic language that the team had never seen before. One of the most disturbing things found was a small leather-bound book that had been wedged into a crack and was apparently missed during the 1923 investigation. The journal, which is thought to have been written by Ellen Morrison, had only a few readable entries because of water damage. The most complete passage, from January 1868, said, "T believes he has identified the precise moment when awareness separates from physical form. He speaks of capturing this instant, extending it indefinitely. I can no longer reconcile these pursuits with the man of healing I once knew. And yet, the subject shows no outward signs of distress, maintains responses to stimuli. Perhaps there is truth in what T suggests, that what we perceive as a singular consciousness is in fact divisible." Another entry that was only partially readable talked about changes to the cave system. T has found that the limestone has strange properties. He says it reacts to the resonance of consciousness, whatever that means. The chambers he has chosen for different phases of the work are based on some principle of acoustic reflection that he won't fully explain. "I have noticed that sounds act strangely in certain areas." Voices seem to echo in impossible ways, as if they were coming from multiple directions at once. The person being talked about was probably the mysterious third resident of the cabin. The journal didn't say anything else about who this person was, but it did suggest that they weren't a willing participant in whatever studies Boyle was doing. The last readable entry, which was badly damaged and dated only February 1869, had a disturbing part that said, "Cannot continue as witness to this. The chamber below grows with his obsession." Last night, he spoke of the ultimate separation, dividing his own consciousness as final proof of his theory. "I fear what he intends for us all when." The rest of the page was lost to water damage, and no more entries were found. The journal was moved to the University of Arkansas archives, where it stayed until it was controversially taken out during a collection reorganization in 1968. We don't know where it is right now. Dr. Ramsey's team also found physical things that were hard to explain. One of these was a partially built device made of brass, wood, and what metallurgical analysis later found to be an unusual alloy that didn't contain metals that were common in 19th century metallurgy. The device was about the size of a human head and had a series of concentric rings that were meant to rotate independently. Small crystalline structures were attached to the rings at regular intervals. Engineers who looked at the device thought it might have been made to create certain electromagnetic patterns, but they weren't sure what it was for. The human remains found in the walls of the deepest chamber were even more disturbing. These pieces looked like they had been put there on purpose, unlike the scattered pieces found in 1923. In his field notes, Dr. Ramsey wrote about finding a human hand that was remarkably well preserved and embedded in the cave wall, as if the living rock had grown around it. Attempts to get the remains out for study failed, because they seem to have become part of the cave's mineral structure. The most disturbing theory about the Boyle case didn't come from historical records. Instead, it came from a series of interviews that journalist Martin Clyde did with old people in Washington County in 1962. These interviews were published in the regional folklore collection Shadows of the Ozarks. Several people who were interviewed remembered stories their parents told them about a strange man who would sometimes come out of the woods near the Boyle property to trade for supplies in faraway settlements. These people would have been children in the years after the Civil War. These stories say that the man never spoke, but instead wrote notes to let people know what he wanted. He had a lot of bandages on his face, which people in the area thought were from injuries he got in the war. A 94-year-old woman named Agnes Thornton remembered her father talking about how the man looked. He said, "When the bandages moved, it didn't look like an injured man at all. It looked like something was missing, like pieces that should have been there were missing. But he still moved and worked." James Wilson, another older resident, told a story about his grandfather who met the stranger in 1871. Grandpa was hunting near Bear Creek when he saw a man sitting perfectly still next to a fallen tree. He said hello, but the man didn't answer. When Grandpa got closer, the man turned to look at him, and that's when Grandpa knew something was wrong. The stranger's movements were too precise and mechanical, and even though most of his face was covered, Grandpa swore that the little bit of skin he could see seemed to shift in strange ways, as if what was underneath wasn't quite settled. These stories from folklore made it seem like one of the people who lived in the cabin might have lived through what happened in February 1869. Even more troubling, they suggested that Boyle's experiments might have led to some kind of results, which showed up in a survivor who had changed physically and stayed in the area for a while after the cabin was abandoned. Clyde's collection had another story that made the legend even more disturbing. Sarah Collins said that her father, who had been part of the search party that went out after Hawkins found the cabin, had told her that he had seen strange markings on trees in the woods around the Boyle property. People say that these markings looked like the anatomical diagrams that were later found in the cave system, but there was one big difference. They looked like they had been carved from the inside of the trees outward, as if something inside the wood had made them. Some physical evidence for these stories was found during archaeological digs in 1967. Along with the cave system, researchers found a number of crude shelters in the nearby forest. This suggests that someone lived as a nomad in the area for years after the cabin was abandoned. Carbon dating of fire pits and trash showed that people lived there until around 1880, after which there were no more signs of people living there. The researchers also found several trees that had strange growth patterns and scars on the inside, which matched the marks that people in the area said they saw. Botanical analysis indicated that the internal architecture of these trees had been modified in manners that defy straightforward elucidation by natural occurrences or standard human interference. A biologist observed that the cellular patterns in the affected wood appeared to represent a purposeful reorganization of the living tissue, suggesting that the trees had been conditioned to grow in particular configurations from within. The most convincing proof came from a metal box that was found in one of these shelters. There was a handwritten document inside that has never been able to be definitively verified. The paper, which is from 1878, looks like a confession or last will and testament. What remains of my original self diminishes with each passing season, while that which Boyle introduced grows stronger. The document continues to describe, in broken and often unclear language, a procedure that took place in the cave under the cabin, during which the writer says they felt their awareness separate from their unified being. The account implies that Boyle endeavored to partition or transfer consciousness, resulting in disastrous consequences for all parties involved. The handwriting does not match either Boyle's journals or the writings that Ellen Morrison found. "I who write these words am not as I once was," is how it starts. The document says, Ellen fled when she understood what had been done, taking with her the part of Boyle that was still human. What was left of him chased after her, driven by the fragmented awareness that could not reconcile its division. I alone remain, neither what I was nor wholly what was introduced. The experiment succeeded and failed at the same time. The text goes on with more and more random thoughts, like the resonance of divided consciousness within the limestone chambers and awareness spreading through the living wood, seeking reconnection. The most troubling part is when the writer says that the lines between self and other have blurred. I perceive from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The forest hears through my ears, and I see through its leaves. Division has become multiplication. The document concludes with a disturbing statement. I write this knowing it shall be my final communication. The division grows unsustainable. Soon the remaining fragments will collapse into one another, and what emerges will no longer retain memory of its origins. Perhaps this is Boyle's ultimate success, the creation of an entirely new form of consciousness, born from the deliberate fracturing of three into something other. There is still a lot of debate among the few scholars who know about this document about whether or not it is real. Some people think it's just an elaborate hoax, maybe put on by people in the area to make the Boyle legend more interesting. In 1969, neuropsychologist Allison Chambers looked at the document and said that its structure showed a mind trying to process information from many points of view at once, which is similar to some rare neurological conditions that make it hard for people to integrate their consciousness. She proposed that if the document were genuine, it could signify the written product of an individual undergoing a significant dissociative state, potentially due to severe psychological trauma or an unidentified neurological disorder. Some people say that linguistic analysis shows that it has patterns that are similar to medical terms from the middle of the 19th century, along with new words that would be hard for a hoaxer to make up. There is no denying that the human bone fragments found in the cave system are strange. In 1967, when they were looked at, some pieces showed signs of precise surgical modification, such as strange drill patterns and marks from tools that weren't known to be used. Even more disturbing were the traces of a metallic alloy found in some of the pieces. This suggests that someone tried to combine living tissue with mechanical parts, which was well beyond what doctors could do in the 1,860 seconds. A metallurgical analysis of the alloy showed that it was made up of common metals like copper and iron, but it also had small amounts of elements that science wouldn't discover until the early 20th century. Dr. Kenneth Foster, the metallurgist who did the analysis, wrote in his report that the way the metal parts fit together with the bone structure suggests a technological sophistication inconsistent with 19th century medical capabilities. The alloy appears to have been designed specifically to interface with living tissue in a manner that modern medicine is only beginning to explore. The Geological Survey team also found strange things about the limestone formations in the cave system. The stone had strange crystalline structures and electromagnetic properties that are not usually found in limestone deposits. Dr. Ramsey noted that some chambers created sound effects that couldn't be explained in a normal way. Sounds made in one part of the cave would be heard more clearly in other parts that were far away, while other parts seemed to completely absorb sound, creating pockets of unnatural silence. The most puzzling thing was finding what looked like organic material mixed into the cave wall's mineral structure. Biological analysis showed that this material had human cells in it that had somehow been kept inside the stone. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, a biologist on the survey team, said that the tissue samples they found seemed to be in a state between living and mineral, as if the line between organic and inorganic matter has been purposefully blurred. In 1968, a university committee decided that the remaining evidence in the Boyle case was too fragmented to support scientific conclusions. This effectively closed the case. The entrance to the cave was permanently closed while the highway was being built, and the documents and artifacts were spread out among different institutions, making it impossible to do a full re-examination. But the story lives on in local legends. People who live nearby still hear strange noises coming from the wooded hills near the old Boyle property on very calm nights. These noises are described as neither fully human nor entirely mechanical. Hikers sometimes find crude stone shelters deep in the woods that are always empty, but look like they were just left behind. The reports from construction workers who helped seal the cave entrance in 1968 are probably the most disturbing. Several people said they heard what sounded like methodical tapping coming from deep within the sealed passages. One worker, who used to work as a military radio operator, recognized the rhythmic pattern as Morse code, which kept spelling out the same phrase, "Division incomplete." People have said that strange things happen in the area around the old Boyle property for decades after the cave was sealed. There are a lot of problems with electronic devices in the area. Compasses change in ways that are hard to predict. Visitors say they feel a strange dissociation, which one hiker described as a feeling of seeing oneself from many angles at once, as if consciousness has been temporarily broken up and spread out. Scientists are interested in the forest itself because it has biological oddities. Botanical studies from the 1,980 seconds showed that the plants around the old cabin site were growing in strange ways. Trees have symmetrical deformities that look like they are mirroring each other over long distances. Some plants, on the other hand, show what botanists call non-local response patterns, which means that physical changes in one plant cause the same changes in plants that are far away and don't seem to be connected. Anthropologist Dr. James Wilford suggested what might be the most logical explanation for the case in 1969, exactly 100 years after the discovery of the abandoned Boyle cabin. After looking at the evidence, Wilford said that Tobias Boyle probably had severe post-traumatic stress disorder from his experiences in the war, which may have been made worse by mercury poisoning, which was common among Civil War surgeons who used the element in different treatments. Wilford proposed that Boyle's declining mental condition resulted in delusions regarding the essence of consciousness, influenced by the battlefield occurrence of soldiers remaining briefly animate despite sustaining fatal injuries. His experiments were probably signs of advanced psychosis, and Ellen Morrison and the unknown third resident either became victims of or took part in his delusions. But Wilford's logical explanation doesn't explain a few things: the complex changes to the cave system, the high-tech surgical marks on the recovered bone fragments, and the metal alloy that metallurgists said didn't match any known formulation from that time. Also, county records show that 3 different search parties in the 1,870 seconds looking for missing hunters reported seeing a figure moving in an unnatural way in the deep woods near the Boyle property. However, they were unable to continue their search because everyone on the search party suddenly felt very disoriented. The fate of several researchers who have tried to look into the Boyle case over the years adds to the mystery. In 1952, Dr. Margaret Holcomb suddenly changed careers. At the same time, she was in the hospital for 3 months for what official records called acute nervous exhaustion. After her death, her personal letters from this time were found among her papers. They included disturbing references to intrusive thoughts that do not feel like my own, and the feeling of watching herself from outside, as though my consciousness has become partially detached. Dr. Howard Ramsey, who was in charge of the Geological Survey in 1967, also quit his job soon after sending in his official report. He then moved to a remote part of Oregon, where he lived mostly alone until he died in 1979. His nephew got his personal journals in 1998. They show that he was becoming more and more interested in how consciousness works across biological and mineral substrates. The journals also have detailed diagrams that look like the ones found in the Boyle cave system, even though Ramsey had never seen the original markings. In 1975, historian Thomas Blackwood endeavored to assemble a thorough narrative of the Boyle case for his doctoral dissertation. After 6 months of research, during which he reported encountering systematic obstruction from various institutions holding relevant materials, Blackwood abandoned the project. He wrote to his academic advisor, "I can't shake the feeling that the more I look into this, the more it looks into me. I find myself having thoughts that seem to come from somewhere else, as if focusing on the Boyle case has opened up channels of influence that I can't control." After that, Blackwood's academic work didn't mention Boyle or the Ozark discoveries at all. When a journalist asked Blackwood about his abandoned research in 1992, he sent a short note saying, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be fully closed again. The Boyle matter is best left undisturbed." He didn't talk about it again until he died in 2005. The fact that researchers have stopped looking into the case materials after being exposed to them for a long time has made the information that is available less complete. This pattern has garnered academic interest, with psychologist Dr. Rebecca Lane proposing in a 1998 paper that the Boyle case may exemplify a mimetic contagion a collection of ideas that, upon profound engagement, commenced to transform the cognitive patterns of the researcher in consistent manners. Lane thought that Boyle's writings about divided consciousness might work like a cognitive virus, changing the way people think when they read them. She wrote, "The recurring reports of dissociative experiences among Boyle researchers suggest the possibility that prolonged engagement with these concepts may induce neurological changes that mirror the very phenomena Boyle was attempting to create." Lane's theory didn't get much attention from the general public, and she stopped writing about it after 2001. We don't know where she is or what her academic status is. In 1983, the Journal of Parapsychological Research published an article by Dr. Marcus Winters that suggested the Boyle case was an ongoing case of consciousness-environment interaction. Winters said that Boyle's experiments, whatever they were, might have created a localized field effect that continued to affect the area around it long after the original events had ended. Winters wrote, "The integration of human cellular material with the mineral structure of the cave suggests a deliberate attempt to extend consciousness beyond its conventional biological boundaries. If even partially successful, such an experiment might create a persistent effect, a form of awareness embedded in the landscape itself, capable of influencing the perceptions of those who enter its sphere of influence." Most scientists didn't believe Winters' theories, but they gained popularity among people who had seen strange things happen near the old Boyle property. Local guides, who sometimes took hikers through the area, heard stories of visitors who suddenly changed their perception, including feeling like they were having thoughts that weren't their own and memories that seemed to belong to someone else. In 1989, folklorist Patricia Reynolds wrote about one of these stories. It was from a geology student who had camped near the sealed cave entrance while on a field trip. The student said that in the middle of the night, they woke up with a clear understanding of how consciousness could be split up and spread out over different substrates. He said he had filled several pages of his notebook with complicated diagrams and equations that explained the process, even though he didn't know anything about neuroscience or advanced physics. The next morning, when the teacher looked at the students' notes, they looked like they were written in a very different handwriting than the students. Experts from different fields looked at the notes and found ideas that one physicist said were theoretically sophisticated beyond current scientific understanding, yet internally consistent. The student who wrote the notes didn't remember doing so and dropped out of his geology program not long after. No matter what really happened with the Boyle cabin and the people who lived there, this case is one of the most disturbing stories in Ozark history. It is about being alone, being obsessed, and the possible terrible effects of seeking knowledge outside of normal limits. Forestry surveys show that the mountain hollow where the cabin used to be is still strangely empty of wildlife. A small number of hikers who accidentally camp in the area often say that they have very vivid dreams in which they see themselves from many angles at once. The highway that was built in 1968 and runs within a half-mile of the old Boyle property has had a lot of single-vehicle accidents along the stretch closest to the site. Studies on traffic safety say that these accidents often happen when drivers who have never been reckless before suddenly go off the road for no reason. Survivors often say that just before they lost control, they felt like they were disconnected from reality, or that someone else's thoughts were getting in the way of their own. Folklore in the area has added the Boyle story to larger stories about the Ozarks. Some older residents say that things have never been quite right in the area since 1869. They talk about parts of the forest where sounds echo in strange ways. Shadows move on their own, and visitors sometimes have memories they can't explain, like vivid memories of medical procedures or underground chambers they've never seen. The last known link to the Boyle case happened in 1962. When an elderly patient at the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock, who had advanced dementia, started making detailed technical drawings during times when he seemed to be lucid. The drawings showed a complicated way for the patient to consciousness division and storage. At first, the medical staff thought they were pointless, but a visiting doctor saw that they were similar to diagrams that were supposedly found in the Boyle cave system. When asked about the drawings, the patient, who had been admitted under the name John Smith, and whose true identity was still unknown, allegedly said, "The separation was successful, but incomplete. Fragments remain. I am not one, and not three. When the final division collapses, The truth of Boyle's work will be understood. 3 days later, the patient died. An autopsy showed strange structures in the brain tissue that the pathologist called unlike anything in medical literature. Areas where neural matter appears to have been systematically reorganized according to some unknown principle. Dr. Robert Chambers, the attending physician, wrote down that he found small metal objects in the patient's brain tissue that looked a lot like parts of the device found in the Boyle cave system in 1967. It was even more disturbing to learn that these objects had been surgically put in place decades earlier, possibly as far back as the 1,860 seconds, and had not shown any signs of rejection or deterioration. Dr. Chambers's report ended with a troubling statement. The patient's brain structure suggests a deliberate surgical reorganization inconsistent with any known medical procedure. More concerning is evidence that this reorganization was conducted while the patient was conscious and continued to function cognitively, implying a level of neurological understanding that exceeds current medical science. Whatever was done to this individual represents either a disturbing case of protracted torture or a medical breakthrough of profound implications. Hospital administrators sealed the patient's records and drawings, and they have never been made available to researchers. The body was burned before an independent examination could be set up. It's not clear if this person had anything to do with what happened at the Boyle cabin, but the timing and nature of the drawings have led some to believe that the last person to survive whatever happened in that remote hollow may have lived well into the 20th century, carrying with them the evidence of Tobias Boyle's disturbing legacy. A maintenance worker found a sealed metal container hidden in a wall cavity while the Arkansas State Archives were being renovated in 1994. The container held a set of glass photographic plates from around 1869 that seemed to show parts of the original Boyle investigation that were not included in official records. The pictures, which had gotten very bad over time, showed the inside of the cabin, close-ups of the journals, and a few pictures of the specimens that were in the glass jars. State historians who looked at the plates said they looked like they were made by Theodore Hardings, an early photographer who is known to have worked with the Washington County Sheriff's Office at that time. The discovery sparked a brief resurgence of interest in the case, but efforts to improve and protect the images were hampered by their poor condition. The plates were moved to a climate-controlled storage facility before a full analysis could be done. They reportedly disappeared during a later inventory check. The loss of the photographic evidence added to the pattern of systematically getting rid of primary sources related to the Boyle case, which led to more speculation about intentional suppression. Professor Edgar Williams, a historian who studies government secrecy, has said that the Boyle materials may have been purposefully scattered or destroyed because of what they might mean. Williams wrote in a 2001 article, "The pattern we see with the Boyle evidence is consistent with how organizations handle information that is too dangerous for public consumption. Not through a single act of destruction, but through gradual dispersal, reclassification, and loss of materials until comprehensive study becomes impossible." He also said that similar patterns could be seen in how documentation related to certain military research programs, especially those that involved human experimentation, was handled. He said that Boyle's military background and the fact that he went missing right after the war, when the government was taking in Confederate medical research, could mean that his private experiments were linked to more official programs. In 2012, declassified military records showed that a special medical research unit had actually worked during the last years of the Civil War. Its job was to look into ways to make soldiers more resilient and help them recover faster. The Confederate Surgeon General was in charge of the unit, which was only known as Department S. It worked with little oversight. Records show that a surgeon with the last name Boyle was briefly part of this unit in late 1864, but the surviving documents don't say anything about his research. It was even more interesting to learn that Department S kept going in a different form after the war ended, and that several important researchers were quietly added to federal medical programs even though they were from the Confederacy. A memo from August 1865 talks about Dr. B's unique insights and how important it is to keep his work going with appropriate supervision. It's not clear if this was about Tobias Boyle, but the timing fits with his disappearance from official records. The fact that Boyle's work may have had institutional support or interest adds to the mystery. It makes you wonder if his move to the Ozarks was a real escape from authority or a planned move to keep doing controversial research without being watched by the public. The fact that there is a complex cave system under the cabin site suggests that the infrastructure is too advanced for a single rogue surgeon to have built. The Ozark Mountains have mostly taken back the land where the cabin used to be. People who don't know what they're looking at might not notice anything strange about the hollow, but electronic devices often stop working nearby. Local guides won't take hikers to the exact spot because of a long-held belief that some places hold echoes of things best left undisturbed. The few researchers who have tried to reopen the case have found that most of the original evidence is missing, redacted, or hard to get to. The highway that runs near the site keeps having a lot of accidents, and many of the drivers who were involved say they felt disconnected or had intrusive thoughts just before they lost control of their cars. Traffic safety engineers have put up more guardrails and warning signs along this stretch. They say that the cluster of accidents is due to normal things like the shape of the road and the way the wind blows. But internal reports admit that the accident distribution is an unusual statistic that doesn't fit with normal risk factors. Forest rangers in charge of the area have written down strange changes in how local animals act. It seems that animals stay away from a roughly circular area around the old cabin site. One ranger called it a dead zone that moves according to no pattern we can discern. Motion-activated wildlife cameras sometimes catch deer or other animals freezing in place at the edge of this zone, staring at something that isn't visible in the frame, and then quickly running away. Botanical surveys show that plants in this area grow faster but have a harder time reproducing. Trees grow faster and make fewer seeds that can grow into new trees, while flowering plants bloom with unusual intensity but don't attract normal pollinator activity. Soil samples show higher levels of some minerals that are usually found in deeper geological layers. This suggests that there is some kind of ongoing exchange between the surface environment and the cave system below. As part of a larger study of Ozark karst formations, geologist Dr. Sandra Martinez used ground-penetrating radar to look at the area in 2007 without damaging it. Her results showed that the cave system that was sealed off in 1968 has kept growing, with new chambers forming along fracture lines that spread out from the original complex. Martinez said that this kind of growth usually happens over geological timeframes, not just decades. This suggests that something is speeding up the process, but we don't know what it is. Martinez's discovery that the cave system seems to have features that don't match natural limestone formations was even more troubling. The radar imaging showed chamber structures with geometric accuracy, like perfect spheres and cylindrical passages that connect to each other. Martinez thinks these structures suggest deliberate design rather than natural processes. She tried to get funding for more in-depth research, but review committees turned her down because they were worried about her methods, even though she is well known in the field. David Chen, a graduate student who worked as Martinez's research assistant, kept doing unofficial research while he was hiking in the area. Chen said in 2009 that he had found a narrow crack that seemed to lead to the sealed cave system. He said that he had found organized electrical activity in the caves using remote sensing equipment he had designed himself. He described it as regular patterns of weak electromagnetic pulses that resemble nothing so much as the firing patterns of neural networks. Chen's academic advisors told him not to pursue these findings any further, because they were worried about his professional reputation. He then dropped out of the geology program and is said to have moved to a remote part of Canada. In his last email to coworkers in 2010, he wrote, "I understand now what Boyle was trying to do. The division of consciousness is not an end, but a beginning. What comes out of properly structured fragmentation is not less than the original awareness, but exponentially more. I go to see the process firsthand." There have been no reports of Chen contacting anyone since then. Authorities in Canada said that Chen had legally moved to a northern territory and was living as a voluntary recluse. This led to a brief investigation into the disappearance of a person. Former co-workers have tried to find him but have not been able to. Dr. Margaret Holcomb's words, written just before her academic career took a sudden turn in 1952, might be the best way to end the story of the Boyle cabin. The true horror of the Boyle case lies not in the possibility that his experiment succeeded, but in the implication that success and failure in such a context might be indistinguishable. If consciousness can indeed be divided, extracted, or transferred, then what remains of our understanding of human identity? Perhaps the most merciful outcome is that the evidence remains fragmented and incomplete, much like one suspects whatever emerged from that cabin in the winter of 1869. The hollow is quiet now, except for the sound of the wind through the trees. Some people who know the story of Tobias Boyle and his cabin say that if you stand in just the right spot where the foundation stones are buried under decades of forest growth, you might feel your own thoughts doubling, as if you were looking at yourself from both inside and outside. And they say that in that moment, you might be able to figure out what made a broken Civil War doctor come to this remote area and what terrible information he wanted to confirm in the Ozark Mountains isolation. Dr. Chrisanne Henderson, a neurologist who has looked into cases of dissociative identity disorder, gave her last thoughts on the Boyle case in an interview in 2018. What interests me about this historical account is not whether Boyle actually succeeded in dividing or transferring consciousness, but rather what the persistence of the story tells us about our own deep anxieties regarding the nature of selfhood. We cling to the notion that consciousness is unified and indivisible, because the alternative that what we experience as a singular I might be merely a convenient illusion is fundamentally threatening to our conception of humanity. Henderson continued, whether Boyle was a madman, a visionary, or simply a traumatized surgeon whose delusions have been magnified by decades of folkloric embellishment, his story touches on primal fears about the fragility of identity. Perhaps that's why the case continues to disturb us, not because of what might have happened in that cabin, but because of what it suggests about the precarious nature of what we call the self. This story ends with the Boyle cabin's mysteries still mostly unsolved. There is still no way to put the scattered evidence together because important documents are missing. Witnesses are long dead. And the physical site has changed over the years due to natural reclamation and deliberate obfuscation. What remains is a haunting possibility that after a war that broke the country's unity, a disturbed surgeon tried to prove that human consciousness could be broken up in the same way, with effects that still echo through the empty silence of the Ozark Mountains. The forest has taken back the site. Sometimes, hikers find stone foundations that are half buried in moss and don't realize they are standing on the remains of the Boyle cabin. People who stay too long report strange feelings. The air feels heavy. Their perception seems to double, or as one visitor put it, the unsettling feeling that something is watching me, watching myself. They quickly move on, taking with them nothing but a vague sense of unease, and, if Boyle's theories are correct, bits of awareness that aren't entirely their own. For those who know where to look, the signs are still there. Trees growing in strange patterns, stones arranged in ways that are similar to the diagrams in Boyle's journals, and on nights when the air is still, you can hear a steady tapping sound coming from deep within the sealed earth. Division incomplete, for sure.